We're about to begin a session titled Crossing Genres, Transmuting Fiction into Drama. Please switch off your mobile phones or put them on the silent mode. There will be a question and answer session at the end of the discussion. We would appreciate if complete silence is observed while the session is in progress. Our guest speakers are Kamila Shamsie, Framji Minwalla, Arshia Sattar, Alex Preston, and Nimra Bucha. The moderator for this session is Muneeza Shamsie. A prominent Karachi-based literary personality, Muneeza Shamsie is the author of Hybrid Tapestries, the development of a Pakistani English literature from colonial times to the present, guest editor of the Journal of Post-Colonial Writing, and managing editor of a work in progress, the Oxford Companion to the Literature of Pakistan. Her extensive work includes 3 anthologies, which she has edited, including the award-winning And the World Changed Contemporary Stories by Pakistani Women. She's a regular contributor to Dawn and Newsline. Ladies and gentlemen, Muneeza Shamsie.
Thank you very much. Hello, can you hear me? No.
It's not on.
Let's
try now.
Is this working? Hello? Is this working or not? Yes, it is, isn't it? Yeah. Okay. What? Yeah, all right. Well, it's great for me to be here.
I think you have to be as close to it as possible.
All right. Well, I'd like to introduce my panel. You can find the full details on the booklet, but this is in relation to their work in theatre. Dr. Framji Minwalla heads the Liberal Arts College at the IBA. He holds a doctorate in dramaturgy and drama criticism. His research interests included performance literature and history, theatre and politics, and he's also writing a book on the history of theatre. Kamila Shamsie was one of 4 fiction writers who took part in a project called Letters Home at the Edinburgh Festival this year, in which each of them wrote a story, a letter, which was then adapted for the stage for a 4-part drama. And it was called Letters Home. And Kamila's letters revolved around the correspondence between 2 Indian soldiers serving in World War I. Nimra Bucha is a distinguished actor, and she's performed in both Britain and Pakistan. She studied drama at Bard College, US, and then she worked in the theatre in London, but most of us, I think, know her because she persuaded her husband, the novelist Muhammad Hanif, to write a play for her, The Dictator's Wife, a one-man play, which was first performed at the Edinburgh Festival and received with great critical acclaim in Pakistan and Britain. She's performed on stage, including the much-praised Begum Jaan, in which she played the title role. Her television work includes Daam and Mera Yaqeen, and she's also in a film and television program, Main Manto, a biography. Arshia Sattar is translator of Sanskrit texts, such as the Ramayana. She has worked extensively with film and theatre and has also taught the subject. She is program director of the Ranga Shankara Theatre Festival and has taught cinema and cultural politics at Middlebury College in the USA. Alex Preston is a novelist, award-winning novelist and journalist and author of 3 novels. His latest novel, Love and War, which is set in Florence during and before and after World War II, is now being adapted into a film. I'm really happy to have such wonderful panelists with me. To give a little preamble, the process of adapting fiction, or rather narrative, for the stage or dramatic spectacle dates back into antiquity. But what we have among us today are new technologies which developed in the 20th and 21st century and continue. And this has extended to drama, to film, to television, and which can now be viewed across the world by huge audiences, often very different to the original readership of a particular work. So in this globalized world, we often hear instances where the author has disowned the film version of his or her book. On the other hand, there are a number of books that many of us remember, chiefly because of the stunning film or script or performance. And then there's a kind of paradox in that, because sometimes people say, well, it's not faithful to the original. Pakistan itself has a very limited tradition of English language drama. And all dramatic performances in Pakistan continue to be subject to a rather draconian Dramatic Performances Act, which was introduced during the Raj and which has been repealed in India and Bangladesh, but not here. But what has happened in our changing world is that English language plays by writers of Pakistani origin have flourished in the diaspora. One of the foremost practitioners remains Hanif Qureshi, while the Pakistani-born Rukhsana Ahmed has a considerable body of theatre and radio work behind her. And of late we have the success of Ayub Khan Deen in Britain. Ayad Akhtar has won the Pulitzer Prize in the United States. In terms of adaptation, Hanif Qureshi has adapted his novels and short story into film. We've also seen the film adaptations of Bapsi Sitwa's Ice Candy Man into Earth, Mohsin Hamid's Reluctant Fundamentalist into a film. And then you have plays such as The Dictator's Wife by Muhammad Hanif, which wasn't actually developed from his novel, but came shortly afterwards, and so sort of kind of works at an angle to it, I think. And Kamila's story, I've already mentioned, was one of 4 developed for a production in Edinburgh. So what happens to a work, this is what we're going to do, what happens to a work of fiction when it is dramatized? This the question I'm going to ask the panel, each one of them, to give me their individual take on how much does it gain, what does it lose, and why, and what are your personal experiences of this in relation to your own work. I think we'll begin from Alex.
Thank you very much.
Begin
Can you
from,
hear me? No. I can really shout, but no? How's that? I'm glad I didn't shout that one. There's a lovely interview with Stephen Frears, the director, talking about making a film of Nick Hornby's High Fidelity. And he said he sat down with the book and he thought, right, I'm going to take all of this richness, all of the story, and he looked at it, he looked at what he could cut out, and he cut, and he cut, and he cut, and he was left with 12 scenes from a 350-page novel. And that has absolutely been my experience. I'm not actually adapting my own novel. A scriptwriter is doing that, but when they gave me the treatment, I said, well, where's everything I did? Because there's nothing left. And it seems to me that is the first experience of the novelist, when you see the transformation from a novel with all of its richness, all of its strange tangents, all of its inscrutability, into the clarity of a film. But of course, where the magic takes place is outside of the script, I think. And it was very interesting having my book firstly adapted for the radio, where they condensed a great deal, but there was nothing other than the words. And actually, it did feel to me very sparse, and that the thing that made the book, which was this evocation of wartime Italy, which was the history, which was the different stylistic treatments by which I had tried to get inside the mind of my characters, all that was lost, I think. What I'm hoping with the film is that it's much more, it obviously puts a huge impetus on the actors, on the way that it's directed, on the way that they try to get across all of those things that I was trying to do through prose in a visual manner. And I think actually, I've only seen the first draft of the script, but my sense is if it is done right, then it is going to, it's going to be much better than the book I wrote.
well, thank you.
There's a wonderful book called The Conversations, which is Michael Ondaatje, the novelist, interviewing Walter Murch, the film editor, and Murch has worked on the film of Michael's novel, The English Patient. And one of the things that's interesting in there is talking about what works better in the movie and what couldn't come across. And one of the things that Michael Ondaatje was desperate to have in the movie was a scene which is really, in terms of the book, I'm not really giving away anything dramatic, but one of the climactic scenes is when an Indian soldier, Kip, who's a bomb disposal expert for the British Army, hears about the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And for him, it's just, and he goes in and he said, you would never have done this to another European nation. And it's a very dramatic moment of this Indian who'd been very integrated in the lives of everyone, suddenly, being in this separate history. And Michael said, he said, I kept insisting it should be in the movie, and we tried and we filmed and wrote and rewrote that scene. But for some reason, he said, what worked on the page simply could not work on the screen. And he said, I still can't tell you why, but at a certain point I recognized film doesn't do this, that what is happening in this scene is not filmic. But he had another example of a moment he loves in the movie, which is when, again, the same Indian soldier walks onto the screen for the first time with an Englishman who's also a soldier, and the two of them walk on together. You have the Englishman and the Indian, and the Indian soldier says something to the Englishman, and the Englishman says, yes, sir. And Michael said the great thing visually is you see, it's 1945, an Indian and an Englishman in army uniform. You naturally expect, and without even knowing you've expected it, you've expected the Englishman to be the superior officer. And that yes, sir, and it's all overturned in the way that the novel so brilliantly overturns all kinds of expectations about how things work around nation. And so I think it's very illustrative of the fact that, it's an obvious point, but the film can do visually things in a moment of something hitting your visual cortex, which a novel would have to sort of labor to set up and describe. That, seeing an Indian and Englishman doesn't have the same effect as seeing these two figures walk in there. So really it is, I think, so much about, these are such completely different forms. The miracle of it is that you have adaptations. The miracle is that people find ways to take forms that work so differently and move them from one into the other.
You should read this.
Should I now? Yes. Okay. Oh, well, there you go. I'm now reading a quote from Michael Ondaatje on The English Patient. Movies not only used different materials, they had different cooking times for their great soups, and had to be consumed in public alongside 800 other people, as opposed to by one solitary diner. A film was closer to the simulated excitement of a soccer stadium, while books were meditative and private act. You sat down to read one or write one, and the first thing you did was ignore the rest of the world. Whereas film had various sous chefs and a studio and a market to deal with. A book could be as secret as a canoe trip, the making of a film more like the voyage of Lord James Patna, uncertain of ever reaching its destination with 1,000 pilgrims on board and led by a morally dubious crew. But somehow, magically, it now and then got to a safe harbor.
I come at this issue slightly differently, and really from the field of drama. One of the things that we do when we teach playwriting to students, and actually when students study screenwriting as well, is we give them an exercise to do. And one of the exercises is to take a short story, to take a piece of prose and adapt it into either a screenplay, a short screenplay, or a short one-act play. And the object of the exercise is really to get students to understand the limitations and also the potential of each medium, how each medium is fundamentally different from the other media. If you look at, my field really is pre-Renaissance drama, theater, performance traditions. And if you look at the Greek tradition, if you look at the Sanskrit tradition, all of those plays actually come from prose or epic poetic works. So the Shakuntala, Kalidasa Shakuntala comes from the Mahabharata, or Aeschylus's plays, Sophocles' plays, they all come from the Iliad, the Odyssey, different aspects, different sort of poetic works, even perhaps not novelistic or fiction, but certainly poetic works. And the sort of operating principle in theater is fundamentally different than the operating principle in prose. And part of the challenge of adapting is to understand how one medium works and how the other medium works in its entirety, and then actually literally translate in its fullness one thing into another thing. Perhaps I'll give you an example from Shakespeare, which actually does not have a novelistic precedent, but it's my favorite line in Shakespeare because in a sense it tells you everything about Shakespeare's stage. So it's very early in Twelfth Night. Viola and the sea captain walk onto the stage. The stage is completely empty, and Viola asks the sea captain, "What country, sir, is this?" And he says, "This is Illyria, lady." And suddenly, this is Illyria. And you can imagine a novelist actually trying to describe this bustling port city with its trade and its goods and the marketplace. And Shakespeare doesn't have to do any of that. All he has to say is, "This is Illyria, lady," and it's there. It happens in front of you. Part of it is about the way in which a kind of material or physical imagination works in relation to things you see, and how a mental imagination works in relation to things you read. And I think that's part of the distinction that might be useful to make in relation to translating one into the other.
Yes, I think for me also, reading and imagination is something that is such a private, individual thing that when you sort of, being an actor, whenever I start to read a book, I invariably try to imagine myself in the lead as the main sort of, and that's my imagination. That's not going to happen. That's never going to happen. So I'll just talk about The Dictator's Wife. That when Hanif was writing the book and the dictator's wife, General Zia's wife, the character was very underwritten. I don't think there's very much about her. And I said, well, if there was a movie about this book, what character would I be? And there was the blind Zainab. And I thought that this character would be much more glamorous. So I said, well, why don't we write this character properly, since you haven't written anything in the book about her. So we started The Dictator's Wife as a side business. So we'd kind of make a little bit of money on the side of the book, try and get bums on seats and things like that. But the play itself changed so much from how Hanif wrote it, because I think when Hanif wrote it, it was written as prose, and the first few performances at Edinburgh, when I was doing those performances, I had a chair, and I was sitting on the chair, and I'd read the play as if without a book. And I think dramatically that didn't do much. And so it was only when I sort of was a bit irreverent, considering that we lived in the same house. I asked him to cut bits, and I left out bits, and we made things around them. It was a long, difficult exercise to turn it into something which would then come alive on stage, and I hope it did. But there's also this story that when I first started working in television, I was working on a script that had been written by a first-time writer. And I think when writers are writing for the first time, there's this temptation. I'm not talking about, I'm just talking about playwrights or people who write for television. There's this temptation that, we have so many things to say, and we can say all of these things, and we've got 20 episodes to say them in. So she'd written these 4 pages of this, magnificent, poetic love scene. And I had some great lines in it. And then we were on set and we were rehearsing these lines. And the person who was playing my husband in that scene, he took a look at the scene and he sort of, it was as if he hadn't even read it. And I'd sort of memorized that scene. And he took a pencil and he just started to cut. And this was a first-time writer, so she couldn't say anything. So he started to cut all those pages out. And he said, "Bas, main make look dunga." And that's what we did. And it turned out okay, I think. So I think he knew a little bit more about television than,
I just wanted to follow Framji, actually, with a Shakespeare incident in Winter's Tale. One of the acts ends with exeunt omnes followed by a bear. Sorry, turn it around. Okay, followed by a bear. Now that's really nice. It's a stage direction to give a director like, okay, find the bear, make everybody leave, make the bear follow them. So of course, we are talking about very different media, and I think the excitement is how a story changes depending on who tells it and where it's told and how it's told. And what I work with Sanskrit epic. And of course, those are stories about the gods. So in that sense, of course, it's never fiction. And in increasingly Hindu India, this is not fiction. What the gods do, it's real. Our gods have birthplaces, and which leads to certain kinds of discomforts for the rest of us. But the interesting thing about the epics being on stage is that they've been on stage pretty much for as long as they've existed. There's always been a tradition of performance of the epics in India. There's been a classical tradition, as Framji mentioned, but there's also a very strong folk tradition where epics are told. The Mahabharata is performed over 9 nights. And if you're in the village, that's what you do. You go and watch it for 9 nights. Nobody goes to hear the story. Everybody knows the story already. But what you go for is to see how Nimra moves from point A to point B, or how Kamila might move from point C to point D, because it's always with the teller. The power of the tale is with the teller. And that, I feel, is even more so for the stage, because in a sense, I'm sure, for those of you who've given your work into a different medium, it's like, whoa, did I really mean that? So in India, we have actually the Draconian Act is with us in India as well. It's just individual states choose whether or not they want to enforce it. So we have a very, very vibrant contemporary theatre tradition in many, many languages. English tends to be, the richest, because, they get more sponsorship. Well, that's not true, actually. I take that back. But English is one of the many Indian languages in which theatre is performed. What happens is that we have these multiple strands of theatrical performance with the epic. We have the classical, we have the folk, which doesn't actually occur in cities, and in metros and in cities, we have young people adapting epic stories, trying to get them to address contemporary concerns. So that gets very exciting, because you put your politics into what is essentially a very, very old story. So we do go back to the epics. Almost, it's like, oh man, okay, I want to do a play. I don't have an idea. Chal, let me do a little bit of Mahabharata, something like that, which is wonderful that they remain rich and so giving. So.
That's really, well, that kind of leads me to the, which is the kind of, South Asia, in fact, we have this very old tradition from the epics, and they were...
Can't hear.
They can't hear you.
Can you hear me now? Oh, okay. Can you hear me now?
I think you just have to speak loudly.
Well, I'm speaking loudly. Can you hear me? All right. Hello. Yes. Okay. Then. Well, there was kind of 2 questions that both Nimra and Arshia. One, of course, is the first one is that we had South Asia. This region has one of the oldest traditions of drama. I think as old as ancient Greek, and you had these epics. But this tradition of drama never passed into Urdu. And we, in Pakistan, I think there's a fairly limited tradition of drama, and the English tradition is even more limited. Virtually non-existent, and yet performances like The Dictator's Wife, I think, had packed audiences. So can someone take this question up and explain why?
There isn't a tradition of theater in the more conventional sense in Pakistan, but there certainly is a performance tradition, and there certainly is a storytelling tradition. There are some, I think, Dastangoi performances today or tomorrow that some Napa actors are doing, which I've seen them do, and it's really fantastic. And if you haven't seen it, you should really try and see it. There's certainly a Qawwali performance tradition, which is immensely theatrical in what they accomplish. So, in a sense, I think the tradition hasn't translated into sort of conventional drawing room comedy, realistic set stage performances, and it has not, and nor has it actually been exploited by the more sort of commercial theater in Pakistan. I mean, the commercial theater in Karachi tends to be, reproductions of musicals at the Arts Council, which, frankly, sorry, I'm not very interested in. But there are many other kinds of performance traditions that have happened in South Asia and in Pakistan, which we do not exploit or we do not think of as theater traditions, and I think we really should. And I think that's part of the way in which to translate from one medium into another, is to start thinking about these things as performances, whereas we don't think about them as performances right now.
Yeah, I think Framji, Dastan Goi, for example, and what Napa is doing here at the festival. There's been a big rise in dramatic readings over the last few years in Karachi, especially, and I think that's out of necessity. It's because to put up a play is a very expensive thing. To have a set, to pay actors, to make costumes, and the most expensive thing is to hire a venue. Even I think Napa now have their own venue, but for the longest time, the only venues here were the PACC, which is now also exorbitantly expensive, and I don't know whether they've replaced their carpeting or not, and the Arts Council. So I think readings have now, out of necessity, become a very popular dramatic medium, and I think we're very good at readings. I think that groups like Zambil and Napa's own people, I don't know, there is some, in English I don't think that there's that many people who are, yeah, mostly in Urdu, and mostly plays, which mostly literature of Isma Chughtai, Manto. So a lot of this literature that I think we hadn't read in school is now being revived through dramatic reading. So that's a really positive thing. But it is out of necessity because it is very expensive to do a play in any other way.
Well, how do they deal with this in India? Is there some...
Well, we're very lucky in India. I should certainly speak for Bangalore, the city in which I live. We have lots of very affordable spaces. Some of them are subsidized by commercial sponsors. Some of them are just subsidized by good-hearted people. So that is amazing, because if you believe that you can produce a play, you will. It's exactly what Nimra is saying. It's when you don't have the capacity to produce a play that you say, okay, I'll do a reading, because at least I'm getting something out there. And I think one of the reasons why the Bangalore scene is so vibrant is because a 21-year-old can afford to rent a space and do a really terrible play. That doesn't matter how bad the play is, but he or she has actually put themselves out there. And also because the spaces are relatively cheap to rent, there's a lot of experimental work, there's a lot of devised work. And I live in Bangalore, so you're always weird about the city in which you live. It's never good enough. This is wrong, that is wrong. But just before I came here, I was talking to two young people who'd come from Bombay, and they want to do immersive theater, right? And site-specific and all that lovely stuff. And they were like, well, can you think of places in Bangalore where we might do this? And in a half-hour conversation, we had a list of 20 or 21 spaces. And I was like, wow, this is incredible. I mean, this is really a gift, So I think the thing that must underpin theater the most is the possibility of performance. Whether that's on the street or in an affordable space or through sponsorship or, through festivals.
Could I ask how much the student drama plays a part either in Pakistan or India? Because if I think of my, you mentioned bad plays, if I think of my own extremely bad acting career, it was all done at Oxford, and I made a total fool of myself, often wearing very few clothes and spouting lines that somebody had written for me which made no sense whatsoever. But I think that university drama in the UK and then the fringe areas, so both in Edinburgh and then increasingly other cities have set up fringe festivals where people can try out things that maybe aren't performed on, London actually doesn't have a particularly good avant-garde theatre scene, that things in London, tend to be, established names doing relatively conventional drama. And so you have to go to Edinburgh, or you go to Bristol, or you go to, some of these tiny Welsh festivals where they're doing really extraordinary genre-crossing, really transformative theatre. So I just wondered, is there any university scene here, or maybe that is a place where this could be started?
There is, but there is no. There are no real, except for Napa. There is no undergraduate. There are no undergraduate theatre programs. There are very few courses on drama, on theatre, on theatricality that are taught. So my sense is that there is a need and there is a desire, and students are constantly putting on plays. They put on all Pakistan drama competitions where small companies come from different universities and schools to perform in competition. But there is very little mentoring or guidance, or so it happens and then it happens again and then it happens again, and there doesn't seem to be much forward movement in. So.
Can I just respond to that? The wonderful thing about bad university theatre is that people get over stage fright. There's a potential for a great actor or a great singer. You don't have to train them. Somebody else has done all that bad work for you. So, it should definitely be encouraged.
I remember Aga Khan used to have a good they'd put up a Neil Simon play once in a while, didn't they? The doctors, the young doctors. Yeah, we had, the hospital. Yes, yeah. No, not the hospital, but the university, the Aga Khan University. The old grammarians used to, yes.
Yes, that kind of.
But also, we don't have grants like you have in the UK. I know you have fewer grants than you used to.
None at all, just about anymore. But yeah.
but
I was still in that era when people would pay for me to, do ridiculous things on stage.
Yeah,
so.
Absolutely. That's what we need. We need to be paid. Because unless you've got time to play with something, and companies that can come together, devise work, you're not going to see good work. Because there's no money to just sit in a room and do the same thing over and over again before you actually show it to the public. So I think that's a big drawback. And I don't know, in India, I don't know if the funding is is everywhere the same sort of.
Not really. The language theatres, what we call Bhasha theatres, non-English theatres, are very, very commercial, and they're hugely successful. But then it's like kind of watching Neil Simon, So it has a different audience, and those of us who fancy ourselves as sophisticated theatre goers, we struggle more to find the money.
But is there government funding for?
Not really.
No.
Very little.
Arts funding.
Yeah.
I wanted to go back to hello. I want to go back to Kamila, but this project of yours that you did, Letters Home, you actually wrote a story, didn't you? And then it was turned into a play. Can you tell us a little more about it? And what did it feel like to see your story developed into a drama?
The commission was the Edinburgh Book Festival happens at the same time as a lot of other festivals in Edinburgh, including the Fringe Festival. And so the director of the book festival wanted to sort of mix things up across festivals. So he commissioned 4 writers, including myself, to write. He said, I just want you to write a short story in the form of letters. It will be adapted. It's not your job to think about the adaptation. You write the story as a story in the form of letters, and then we'll hand it over to the Gridiron Theatre Company, and then they have to do whatever. And so mine was between 2 soldiers who were fighting with the British Indian Army in the First World War. One was wounded and back in Punjab, and the other one was taken prisoner of war in Turkey. And I wrote, and at the end of writing it, I thought, I have no idea how they're going to do this. And actually, the theatre company got hold of a filmmaker, a really wonderful filmmaker, to do a short film of it. And she had 3 screens at the same time. And one screen was Punjab, one screen was Brighton, where the Indian soldiers were in hospital, and one screen was, not Turkey, sorry, Mesopotamia. And there is something goosebumpy about that moment when you see your characters, even though they're not as you imagine them to look, but your characters are speaking on a stage. And there's something about, it's again about the visual as opposed, and the way the imagination works differently. And it was extraordinary, and also she'd made it a better, tighter, more compact sort of thing, because she had, I think, 20 minutes, whereas I could write a story of whatever length I wanted. So she really pared it down to what was essential, but then did these beautiful visual things in it.
But there is something that feels almost invasive in that moment when you see something that so far has really only existed in your imagination. When you see it out there and taken away from you, I do feel there's a kind of sense of loss there, as well as this amazing magical thing that's happened.
I think if it were to ever happen to a novel, I would have to sort of steel my heart against it. Because with a novel, of course, you spend a year, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years inhabiting this world and these characters, and you know them intimately and you see through their eyes. And you have a very strong physical sense, right, of what your characters are like. Because of the short story that I spent 3 days over, it became much easier. And it became much easier for me to say, do anything with it. But I did ask Michael and Darchi about the movie of The English Patient. I said, what did it do to your relationship with the book that you'd written? So for instance, when you now think of Hannah, the character in your novel, do you see Juliette Binoche, and who plays Hannah in the movie? And Michael said, well, I would have no problem with seeing Juliette Binoche, but he said, no, Hannah is Hannah. She looks like, and he said, it's not so much about her face, it's my physical sense of who she is. I wrote her, and that's who she will always be to me. This film, Hannah is someone else.
I was speaking to David Nichols, who wrote One Day, which is a very successful book, and he said he had mixed feelings about it. He adapted it himself into a film with Anne Hathaway, and he had mixed feelings about doing it, and he realized he will not adapt another one of his books because the reason that he wanted to adapt it for the film was because he didn't want to let go of those characters. He didn't want to give them up, and he said he thinks it would have been a much better film if he had managed to hand over that and had somebody else's imagination enacting and overlapping with his own.
I don't know if it'll ever happen or not, but it was a way of making the idea very appealing.
Well, actually, that brings me to something that that keeps going on in my head for a long time. I've seen a lot of English plays, English fiction or English plays actually, being adapted for the stage in Pakistan into Urdu. I don't have an issue with that. I have often wondered why those very plays, which seem to lend themselves so naturally to our environment, are simply not adapted and performed in English, where you actually just change the names. I mean, people do adapt plays and just give them a different names. You know, things like The Doll's House, and there was that wonderful my portrait of a lady. They made that wonderful series called Parchaya. And then the other one was Uncle Vanya, which was made as Habib Mamu. I mean, I've seen both Uncle Vanya and Habib Mamu, and they seemed to have a very clear echo. Why couldn't we just do it in English? Does anyone have a question? Why couldn't we just do these plays in English? Why do we need to change the language? And I wanted to ask, and what is the difference in the audience? That Nimra would know.
I think that people think that more people will watch Urdu plays. I have done both a translation and an adaptation with the National Academy of Performing Arts. I did The Seagull, which was a costume drama, really tight costumes. And that was a very, very true translation, as true as you can be. And then I did an adaptation of an Arthur Miller, All My Sons. And the difference in both of those, first of all, I don't know why people seem to think that Arthur Miller translates so well into Pakistan, where it actually doesn't. But because it's simply written, maybe, you know, there is the sort of father and the son, and I don't know. I mean, Framji, you might know more about this, why people think that they should do more Miller in Pakistan. But it's not, I think that the problem is that there isn't enough work to perform. There isn't enough original Urdu work that can be performed. So the next easiest thing, the next thing to do is to pick up a play that seems a bit like it could be set here in Pakistan, and then you just do it and you hope that the audience will come and relate to it, and if it's in Urdu, they will understand it. But I think that the Chekhov, the Seagull, was much more a successful production.
Could I ask,
it was true.
Was that translated from English?
From
into,
English, from
so,
English,
So
yes.
you're taking
Not
a
from the
Russian
Russian.
text, because
No,
that's
not
very
from the
interesting
Russian,
that
yeah.
it's a kind of triangulation.
Yeah,
there.
yeah, it was from the English to the. But I think the Urdu one was probably closer to the Russian than the English, possibly. I don't know. I don't know Russian.
Well, certainly Ibsen would do very well in Pakistan, right? All that religious guilt and...
Yeah, I think
And,
beyond
you know,
after Ibsen,
yeah.
it's a bit dodgy.
There's a radio show in London, which both Alex and I have been on, called the Saturday Review, where people turn up and you get to review the week's cultural happenings. And there was an Ibsen play, Ghost, and the host of the show turned to me first about this, and he said, look, here's this play, it's all about religious guilt and people being stuck in marriages and not being able to get out of them. You know, does this have anything to do with our contemporary world? And I just said, I'm from Pakistan.
Yeah, I think no, Chekhov, Ibsen, yeah, definitely, it's us.
But there was, a recent production of the Bernarda Alba,
Yes.
the Lorca play at Napa.
Yes.
They did a really nice Urdu adaptation of Winter's Tale recently. And I think the reason to do them in Urdu is that it reaches a larger audience. There are more people who come. And even though it is incredibly difficult to translate Shakespeare's poetry or Shakespeare's language into Urdu, it is perhaps more effective to do that, because at least people will have a not A-levels understanding of Shakespeare, as in understanding of Shakespeare as that is theatrical and fun and enjoyable to watch, as opposed to sitting in class and reading To Be or Not to Be. That is
Also, Shakespeare is Punjabi, Framji.
yeah, and Shakespeare's Punjabi, yes. So I think one of the things that I keep saying is that all of these Renaissance plays, plays by French writers, plays by English writers, are incredibly close to some of the cultural, social issues that we confront in Pakistan, which perhaps tells us something about Pakistan. But issues in Shakespeare's plays, issues in Webster's plays, issues in Moliere's plays, issues in Racine's plays, and certainly in the Greek tragedies. And we should be doing, one of the ways in which to maybe jumpstart indigenous writing is to translate these plays into Urdu, regularly perform them so that people can learn by watching. Yeah. Because there are very few, if any, young Urdu, Sindhi, Punjabi, Pashto, Seraiki playwrights, Balochi playwrights. There just aren't any. And it would really be a boon to give people, even what we do and what exercises that we do for students is say, all right, take this play and translate it, right? Take this short play or these short scenes and simply translate them, and the very act of translating it teaches you something about the medium of theater. And by learning about the medium of theater, then you actually begin to learn how you might be able to write a play in your indigenous language, in your mother language, in that form. And that is what is not happening. And that somehow that really needs to happen to jumpstart the theater. Yeah.
I wanted to, in a kind of reverse thing, I wanted to ask Arshia, you see we're talking about translating English plays into Urdu. In India, you had the Mahabharata, which was adapted by Peter Brook into this wonderful 6-hour television serial, and which was greatly admired in the West. Some Indians I met had reservations about it, and of course it's a text that's dramatized in India. So I wondered your reaction, response, and everything else to it.
Every Indian theatre person wants to answer this question because we're very well. What happened with us, or me, I should say, many of us. I was in graduate school in the U.S. when this play was going on, right? And we were translating Mahabharata in class, and we owned the text. And then suddenly we here's this white guy, taking our play, our work, and turning it into a play with white actors for white people, right? And we're in graduate school where you know everything, right? And you're just like, well. Look at them. And the play came to BAM in New York, and all our teachers went to see it, and we were like, oh, look at them, they're just Orientalists in the end, And they flew to New York, they paid $100 to see this play, and all these, we were like little gremlins, So, of course, we decided to hate it, and we decided to hate Peter Brook, and, this was just, he's supermarket shopping, he's come and taken something from Terracotta, and he's taken from Satria, and he's taken from, what does he know? And then many years later, I saw my mother-in-law was watching something on TV, that looked really strange. And so I was like, wow, what is this? And it was, she was watching the sort of tape, the videotape in those days of this film. And I was like, this is just fantastic. And now I teach from it. I mean, who can teach Mahabharata? Nobody's going to read it, right? So we watch Peter Brook together. And every time I say, oh, you know, I've seen it 25 times, oh, I've seen it 35 times, I start the film and I cannot leave. I mean, it is just so compelling. But Girish Karnad, who is, of course, perhaps contemporary India's greatest playwright, he said a wonderful thing when he came back from betraying us and, you know, seeing the Mahabharata in New York. He said, Mahabharata works because it's always about the last war. It's always about the war that is closest to you. So it's everybody's story, you know, and so you know, we also had that same sense of ownership about Gandhi, Attenborough doing Gandhi, you know, and like Gandhi is played by a white man, you know. It's really silly. But we haven't got over it. I mean, you know, I think it's a necessary reaction. I think it's important to point that out, but it's also very important to get past it. And most recently, it's happened with Tim Supple's production of Midsummer Night's Dream. It was about 4 years ago. It was commissioned by the RSC, and Tim Supple, of course, is a great Shakespeare director, and he did Midsummer Night's Dream in 6 Indian languages. Right? And of course the Indians were climbing up ropes and jumping through fire, and we're watching this like, wow, man, you made monkeys out of us all over again, you know. But it is a theatrical spectacle, but there ain't no white guys climbing up that rope, you know. It was only us. So it's I mean, these are things that really need to be noticed and negotiated. I think it would be foolish to ignore them, but it's also really silly to hang your hat on that peg, you know, forever. So.
Yeah, one of the things that when you study theater history you learn is that in fact the theater performances emerge out of religious traditions and religious performance and religious ritual. And Greek theater emerges out of that, medieval theater emerges out of that, Indian Sanskrit theater emerges out of that, Japanese theater emerges out of that, Chinese classical theater emerges out of that. If you actually go to Iran, one of the sort of more one of the really interesting performances that happen there are sort of passion play dramatizations of Ashura and the Ashura processions, and and this is one of the things that does not happen here. That we have actually divorced, in some ways, notions of spirituality and devotion, which is central to any understanding of theater and performance, and actually theater and performance. That theater and performance, for the most part, is seen as a secular activity separate from these things. And this is one of the cultural, social things that we do, is we'd like to compartmentalize our lives and say that these things are religious and these things are social and these things are political, these things are cultural, and not to understand the ways in which they work together. And perhaps one of the ways in which we can make good theater happen in Karachi and translate narrative stories that we all know, that are part of not only Pakistan's or our religious history, but our not my religion perhaps, but yes, my religion, because I was born here. I mean, I'm not a Muslim, but yes, I am a Muslim because I live here. It's like, we have a very complicated relationship with each other, and we don't allow our performances to reflect it. And I think this is one of the ways in which we can begin to rejuvenate theater in the city. Anyway.
Hello, any questions? Do we have any questions? Framji, can you do this? Because frankly, folks, I've left my glasses behind.
Is there a question here?
I have a question for Kamila, Shamsie. My question is that when we compare Pakistani writers with the writers in England or America, our writers, they haven't picked up the bold subjects, just like exploitation, religious issues, and there are many other issues. I have read Julian Barnes' A Sense of an Ending. So such sort of topics, you see, I have also read your book, In the City by the Sea, or Pepsi Sedwa's book, The Crow Eater. But I have found that the bold subjects, just like exploitation, Legion, nowadays I have observed that the children, they are compelled to put on the turbans and they are being misguided. So I think you see that the bold topics are missing, just like hypocrisy, exploitation, especially in Legion.
I don't think this is really a theatre question, so I'll just quickly say the more writers you have, the more subjects you have. If you want to read about religious exploitation, read Nadim Aslam to start off with. But also, I should mention, if you're talking about English language novels, England has considerably more writers than Pakistan does. But does anyone have a question on theatre, I think? Yes.
Hi. Would it always be the case that movies or plays would be better than the book itself? Or are there special cases in which that would be different?
Is it shall I repeat? The question was, is it always the case that movies or theatres are better than the book itself? Or are there cases when the poor, sullied book might be better? Alex, you're going to have your book made into movie. Will it have to be better than your book?
I took a deep breath there rather than challenge you outside, as I should have done. The books are always better than the films, is my belief.
Unless the books are quite bad to
Unless
begin
the
with.
books are really terrible. No, I still don't, we're talking about drama, so I will make this brief, but I don't believe that there is a better way into the mind of another human being than the novel, and I have yet to see a film that persuades me otherwise.
Well, the classic response to this is which is the only book that is not as good as the movie? The Godfather.
They're fundamentally different forms, and if you think of them as in some way, if you think of them in comparative terms, one will always end up being lesser or greater or better than the other. But if you think of them as two fundamentally different works of art,
or complementary,
complementary works of art, I think that may be a more useful way to think about it. I mean, if you look at the recent film of Atonement, and if you read Atonement, the film is relatively faithful in structure and in cinematic style, translating some of the things that Ian McEwan does narratively, but they are two completely different works.
Except that it can't get the it seems to me that uncertainty is absolutely at the heart of that book, and film doesn't do uncertainty or ambiguity well.
Yeah. No, you're right.
Unless it's Meryl Streep, in which case it does everything.
I have a question. What is the general reaction to the addition of an additional dimension to a book when it is being dramatized or filmed, when music is introduced and dance is introduced, and there is that kind of an entire dimension introduced to the book when it comes on as a play or a film or whatever? What is the general feeling? Because something new is being introduced. It's not part of the original thinking of either the writer or the playwright or what have you.
What happens when music and dance is introduced into a film?
I think the less fidelity is paid to the original, the better the chance the film has of success. I think a filmmaker has to think, what do you need to make this work as a film? Anyone who's too closely tied to the book, which is why David Nichols probably wouldn't be the best person, because he's too closely tied to the idea of this narrative in a novel form. And you need someone who'll say what will work, what works with the kind of film I want to make, and that'll be interesting to watch.
But I think one thing that's really interesting there is that you're settling upon the idea of music, and music is one of the things that film uses to draw itself towards what a novel can do, which is the effect, which is to create, what music operates in a kind of somewhere back here in the brain. It doesn't operate in the conscious mind, and I think
songs and dances and that kind of addition.
Like a Bollywood
an
film.
entire
which is not my expertise, so I will hand it over.
Like My Fair Lady, for instance, that kind.
Well, I was just thinking of Gurinder Chadda's Bride and Prejudice or whatever she called it, which is just like, I mean, in my ever humble opinion, just rubbish. But I think she used song and dance very well in that. You know, she turned it into a story about a big fat Indian wedding, and I imagine that big fat Pakistani weddings also, you have to sing, you have to dance, you have to, you know, I mean, the joie de vivre that she gave what is fundamentally a sarcastic novel was quite marvelous. You know, it didn't suit me necessarily, but I was like, good on you, girl, you went for it. You know.
Well, I'm looking forward to Kamila's musical Antigone. I think there's lots of song and dance.
Yeah. There was also a movie, a Bollywood movie that was made into a play. 14 songs, 4 weddings and a funeral. What was the original movie?
4 weddings and a funeral?
No, the Salman Khan film.
Hum Aapke Hain Kaun.
Hum Aapke Hain Kaun. Hum Aapke Hain Kaun was made into a play. Yeah.
I've got a notice saying it's time up.
Yeah.
Thank you all very much. Thank you to the audience and thank you to the panel. I could have gone on talking to you for a long time.
So are you seriously going to do this?